What is a kinsman redeemer? It's not a term we use in our culture, but as we go through the book of Ruth, the theme of redemption is so strong: to rescue, to bring back, to buy back, and to take care of. And so Ruth is in a vulnerable position. Her husband has died, and in chapter 3, verse 9, she's talking to Boaz, and she says, "You are a kinsman redeemer." Well, what does a kinsman redeemer do? There are many roles, and it could include marriage, but it also could include helping extended family with land, or someone who is sold into slavery and helping return that extended family member. It could even tie in with avenging and making right or making justice out of someone that has been wronged in the family. But the idea is protection and provision, and there's a unique role. Now, Ruth and Boaz have potential to be married, but he's not the closest male relative. So that's another twist in the plot. But this kinsman redeemer role, Boaz is interested in being faithful and stepping up and helping his extended family. And it's a beautiful thing. And as you think about redemption, this picture leads us to Jesus, who provides and protects us in ways that we can't on our own, and how vulnerable we are. So kinsman redeemer, it's an important term. Dive into the book of Ruth and see the beauty of the role of the kinsman redeemer.
I was honest with the first service, so I'll be honest with you guys too. I kind of inherited this stop. Brian and I talked last year during our Unlikely Heroes. We preached on Ruth, and we realized the value in this short little book. There's so many good things. And so we didn't really know how it was going to break down, but I will say that whenever I started looking into inheriting the kinsman redeemer, I was like, my lazy side was like, I got to go back and do the historical context and teach you guys all that part, and I get to step away from the love element a little bit. But I think we've molded it together in a way that we get to do both. And just like we just watched, the role of the kinsman redeemer in Israel was extremely important. I want us to remember, though, that the closest relative able to be a kinsman redeemer was not necessarily obligated to follow through with the redemption. So we have to see that there's obedience to come out of this, and there's just some more plot twists that are going to come along in our love story. And so let's quickly summarize the first two chapters in our Ruth series for those of you who missed either of our previous messages. Brian conveyed the story of Ruth as a love story, a notebook type love story with twists and turns and suspense and a beautiful ending. He's such a sap, isn't he? I swear, he's always trying to earn brownie points with his wife, Mary, and he throws in notebook love stuff. But the first chapter in Ruth opens with Elimelech and Naomi leaving Bethlehem and its drought-stricken land for greener pastures in Moab. But Moab was a bad place that did not acknowledge Yahweh as their God and was filled with sinful people. Probably not the best place for the Israelites to go, was it? Their sons Mahlon and Chilion marry Moabite women, further disconnecting themselves from their Israelite heritage. But then tragedy strikes. Elimelech and both his sons Mahlon and Chilion die in Moab. Naomi, now widowed, mourning the loss of her two sons, decides to go back to Bethlehem because she's learned that God is blessing the land again, and they're starting to see good harvest. It has become fruitful. But Naomi tries to push away both her daughter-in-law, but one refuses to go. And which one is that? A+. The rest of the chapter 1 is filled with Naomi's grief. She goes down the familiar path, wondering why God continues to just smite her, why God did this to her, and falls into that self-pity that we can probably all relate with at times. What she failed to see, though, was the faithfulness and love of Ruth right in front of her very eyes. Grief has a way of obstructing our view of the good that is still in our life when we're going through it, doesn't it? I have to give some credit to my counterpart, Brian, for bringing forth a nature of God that I hadn't really focused on too much before we started this series. Brian opened my eyes and brought forth this doctrine of God's providence as the underlying theme throughout the book of Ruth. Essentially, God's providence is his guiding hand over our life that it explains all those coincidental things. I love the story that Eric Hansen, one of our elders, shared this morning. He'd been trying to get a car for his son Jack. He'd been to Champaign and Bloomington and Springfield and all over the place trying to get this done. But God said, relax, I got this. So he prayed, he continued to pray. He got on Craigslist a couple days later, and there was this car that looked like everything they wanted. They called, he said hello to the gentleman, and I said, how are you? And he said, blessed by God every day. So is that not a testament from God and with a stranger saying, here it is? He said it wasn't by noon or whatever, and the car was in their possession. So that's how our God works. That's what we're seeing throughout the book of Ruth. God's providential hand working in ways that if we'll just simply let go and let God, he'll work it all out, won't he? It's really a beautiful thing. So, as we continue in understanding this providential hand of God, we just need to understand that he does it through putting the right people at the right time in our path. It's not necessarily this magical thing that just happens. It's wholesome people doing the things of God and being obedient. How many of you believe that God works all things out for the good of those who love him? Those who have been called according to his purpose? Well, Ruth chapter 2 then is kind of a stepping stone, a transition away from Naomi's grief and into this understanding that God's goodness is still there. We start to see the story unravel a little bit, in a good way, or reveal itself, I should say. We began to witness more examples of God's providential hand working through the obedience of this foreign widow named Ruth. Coincidence, right? Ruth just so happened to wind up in Boaz's field picking up grain behind the harvesters. Boaz just so happened to be a close relative of Elimelech's clan. Boaz just so happened to provide protection for Ruth by telling all the other men not to harm this foreign woman gleaning in the fields behind the harvesters. And wouldn't you know it, Boaz just so happened to show Ruth where the water jars were to get a drink anytime that she wanted. Just so happened? Or God's providential hand? I think you get where I'm going with that. The essence of chapter 2 is beautifully portrayed in 2 verses. So listen to Boaz's response to Ruth in verses 11 and 12. I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. And then the most beautiful part, may you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Is that not a beautiful representation of how we should react with our God, God the Father? A refuge, a place of refuge that can be had that is always there for us. No matter what your circumstances are, God is there and is a refuge. Chapter 2 is the beginning stage of this love story of developing between Ruth and Boaz. They don't even realize what is happening, and it takes Naomi's recognition of God's providential work to set it all in motion in chapter 3. So if you want to turn with me, you can follow along up here, but we're going to be in Ruth chapter 3. We're going to go through the entire chapter, and we're going to break it up, and we're going to focus on the first 6 verses this morning. Give you a little bit longer. Ruth chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. One day, Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you, where you will be well provided for? Is not Boaz, with whose servant girls you have been, a kinsman of ours? Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself and put on your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you're there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he's lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. I love how verse 1 starts out. It starts out, one day, magically, this day, Naomi decided to give this advice. What have we learned from this story before? Nothing happens by chance, right? So we know this is God's urging and prompting over Naomi to send Ruth to Boaz. Now, Naomi has been feeling a little uneasy at the fact that Ruth is not doing what typical women of her age would be doing, raising kids, seeking another husband. Ruth has stayed and cared for her and foregone a lot of those things that you would have typically seen these women at that time doing. So Naomi, who knows the customs as God's chosen people, sets these redemptive wheels in motion. We get to see, as somebody who knows the custom, who understands it, because Ruth wouldn't as a Moabite, set this redemptive plan in motion. And I love Ruth's response in verse 5 and 6. It's a testament to her obedience. We'll reread, we'll look at those. Ruth says, I will do whatever you say. What if we had an attitude like that towards God? What if we responded to God that way? What if when God laid something upon our heart and we knew that we were to do it, if we responded, I will do whatever you say? Well, I know what would happen. We'd start to see the blessing that is filled throughout the book of Ruth. Now, it is important that we kind of take off our cultural lenses for a minute and we try not to view, my mother-in-law was in first service, it was great, but we try not to view Naomi as a meddling mother-in-law here. I got some Snickers from that one, but that's not the intent. Also, we need to not view Ruth as any less desirable because of her pursuit of Boaz and being so direct about it. So we need to kind of look back at the custom side a little bit of the time. And I love the question posed in my commentary by David Jackman. It says this: are we meant to learn about how to arrange marriages in this chapter? Essentially, are we supposed to then set up marriages in the same way that we just read today? Of course not. Different time, different culture, different practices. So clearly we need some vital background information if we're going to make sense of it all. Do you remember how the Kinsman Redeemer had the ability to redeem land for deceased family members that we showed in the beginning? You guys with me? A little bit? Am I putting you to sleep? So why is that so important? The land was God's promise to the Israelite people. Remember how they were led out of captivity in Egypt toward the promised land? What happened though? Through grumbling about God's provision, tired of eating the manna, they wanted to go back into captivity. So God did not bless that first generation that was taken out of slavery. It was their faithful offspring, who we come to learn through Joshua, who was led into the promised land. That land, though, was always God's. It was always meant to go back to God's. But sometimes, as we being believers in God understand that life happens, doesn't it? So the book of Ruth, we get to see that there is no heir for this land that God has given them to oversee. So as a poor widow, Naomi is forced to sell this off. But here's what it is. That land will always come back. And as we've seen in Ruth, there are times when these circumstances come up. And for you to understand this, I think we need to go to Leviticus 25, 23 through 28. Now, if you want to turn with me, you can. I don't have it up here, but I'm going to read it to you. So Leviticus chapter 25, 23 through 28. The land must not be sold permanently, because the land is mine, and you are but aliens and my tenants. Whose land is it? Perfect. Throughout the country that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. If one of your countrymen becomes poor and sells some of his property, his nearest relative is to come and redeem what his countryman has sold. It's this kinsman redeemer that we're talking about, okay? If, however, a man has no one to redeem it for him, but he himself prospers and acquires sufficient means to redeem it, he is to determine the value for the year since he sold it and refund the balance to the man whom he sold it. He can then go back to his own property. But if he does not acquire the means to repay him, what he sold will remain in the possession of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. It will be returned in Jubilee, and he can then go back to his property. So either way, the land always reverts back to the family. But God has instituted a way through this kinsman redeemer understanding to get it back if the opportunity presents itself. So my commentary concludes the section with this passage. It says, Naomi took the initiative but she followed the direction which she believed God was already pointing out. She understood the custom. She understood the culture. She realized all the perfections of Ruth being in Boaz's field to see what was happening, and she stood up and pointed her in God's direction. So let's look at Ruth 3, 7 through 9. We're still in chapter 3. We're going to look at verses 7 through 9. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she replied. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer." Now, I want to point out something that doesn't directly come out of the text. It was suggested that Boaz would have been surrounded by a group of other wealthy landowners that were also on the threshing floor. They had just finished a feast. They were in good spirits, and this would have been dangerous for Ruth because women sneaking on to the threshing floor, which wasn't permitted to begin with, at this hour, she may have been harmed, taken advantage of, or perceived as this being some kind of promiscuous act. So let's not forget, on top of all of that, she's what? A foreigner. Her obedience to follow Naomi's advice was risky business. And I think that's a very good lesson for us today. Does God always call us into the comfortable? Does He call us out of our comfort zone and ask us sometimes to go into situations that are going to push the very essence of our comfort zone? Absolutely. I get random phone calls to go into some of the most traumatic experiences, and I'm just like, God, can we do that another time? Can you send somebody else into that? But when we're obedient to God, He blesses us. And we've seen that because what has God done for Naomi and Ruth ever since they came back? Provided barley, provided grain. And not just enough, but in abundance. So we really need to focus on that obedience part. It's not always comfortable, but God will always bless us if we remain obedient. But we must be bold in pursuing God's direction in our lives. So that's one application that we can take right out of the scripture. Verse 9 unveils Ruth's true motivation to Boaz, and this is extremely important. He understood what she was doing in her pursuit of him. Ruth's step of faith in going to Boaz is a huge statement towards whether or not he is going to redeem them. Now, I don't want to spoil the ending, so let's conclude the chapter. Let's read verses 10 through 18, and we'll highlight a couple of the verses. There's a lot of good stuff in here, so I don't want to go over it too fast, but really kind of tune into what's happening. There's a transition here. Boaz, startled, wakes up, kind of gets his bearings, realizes what her intention is and why he's there, and now you can feel a righteousness inside of him. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask." This is a beautiful part here. "All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character." This foreign woman in a land that she was not accustomed to is seen by everyone as having noble character, from Moab at that. "Although it is true that I am near of kin, there is a kinsman redeemer nearer than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem, good, let him redeem. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, "Don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor." He also said, "Bring me the shawl that you are wearing and hold it out." When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." I love verse 10, and I think it's the highlight of the entire chapter, so let's look at that again real quick here. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "The kindness is greater than which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor." You see, most women in Ruth's position, they would have done exactly what Boaz points out. They would have went for the young, strapping man to provide for her, the one with money. They would have sought the things like the world tempts us to do, but she didn't do that. Instead, she continued in her devotion to Naomi. Remember that the whole town understood her character at this point. And that's really another thing that's important. If you start being obedient to the things of God, you're going to develop a reputation that supersedes yourself. You don't have to go out and proclaim, "I'm this wonderful gift of God." You just have to be obedient to Him, and that action will speak for itself. There are people, I came into work Monday or Tuesday. I don't even remember, it all runs together anymore. But I came into work and I got a text message from somebody who knew me previously that said, "I want to be baptized. Can you help me do that?" This is not somebody I would have ever anticipated would reach out to me to do that. But God working through me, not me doing anything. I don't want any credit. God working through me has put this beacon out for people to come to for a place to seek that refuge, to have that conversation. That's what being obedient to God will do in your lives, because we're all ministers of the Word. Amen to that one? We are all ministers of the Word. Our life is to reflect the gift of Jesus Christ that we've been so richly blessed with and given. Boaz is saying, though, here that you seeking to redeem this promised land, the gift from God to His people, supersedes anything that you've done for Naomi. You have committed your life to Yahweh and His terms, and you're following through rather than pursuing the things of the world, the younger men, the money, all the temptation. And it's important because Boaz is also a man of God seeking to be obedient. This is an affirmation to him that her motivations are pure. Verses 11 through 14, this is that point in the story. This is that, oh man, is the girl going to get the guy? Is it all going to fall apart right here? It's that notebook type story that we've been talking about. What will happen? It's the plot twist. One that questions the entire ending of the story. See, Boaz's heart is now positioned wholly on Ruth, but he's not the first in line to redeem her. We have to remember there are customs in place. There are things set in motion by God that they have to honor. So you remember the Kinsman Redeemer doesn't have to follow through with any of it. There's still a choice that has to be made. Isn't that what obedience is? A choice that we get to make? This is especially true for Boaz. So you have to wonder, what is going to happen? And the chapter ends with something seemingly insignificant because it's become a regular occurrence in the Ruth narrative. In verse 15, Boaz again blesses Ruth with several weeks' worth of barley for her to take home to Naomi. Why is that important? Well, think about it. Not even a foreigner should have been behind the harvesters getting and working for 1 day's worth of barley. But we've seen continually through her blessing for being obedient that she's carrying home a sack full of grain that she didn't even have to pick or clean. Does God not take care of us if we're obedient to Him? So stop fighting against God and just live your life for Him. And you will receive blessing in the richest, fullest, most full measure that you could ever dream. Sorry, that's just my ministry in life right now spilling over. That's what God is showing. If you just give me your life, I'll take care of your needs. And then in verse 16 and 17, imagine the look on Naomi's face to see Ruth coming with all that barley. She knows something amazing happened. It's like you going out, ladies, on your first date, coming and, "Girl, tell me how your date went." Come on, that was funny. I put myself out there for you guys to laugh at me. Take the opportunity. That's what Naomi's doing right here. She's like, "Tell me all about it." She sees the blessing coming down the road before she ever has to open her mouth. Can you feel Naomi's grief lifting? The first chapter was all about her grief and her loss of her husband and her children. You can't see through the grief sometimes to understand that the goodness and the blessing still exists. God doesn't change, it doesn't go away. But as the story progresses, you get to see that grief lifting off Naomi. The clouds of grief do subside, they go away. So let this part of the text be a reminder for those of you struggling right now. God is there, He's still good, and He didn't go anywhere. God continually shows His providential work through the foreign woman's obedience. And now we see it through Boaz and his obedience. And the same thing happens in our life when we rely on God to get through each day. But we don't ever get all the answers given to us, do we? A lot of us want that burning bush. We say, God, I will do whatever you ask if you just present yourself right in front of me. Or give me that burning bush and let me know beyond a shadow of doubt that's what I'm supposed to do. But it's a trust thing. All God ever does is reveal enough for us to continue and be obedient to Him each and every day of our life. I can honestly say that I never gave it much attention before this sermon series, how God providentially works through individuals at just the right time, at just the right moment, through just the right communication, through every little tidbit that He cares for us. But since Brian brought this forward over the course of the last 2 weeks, I can look back so many times and see that it's true. It's scary, it's wonderful, it's amazing, but God is guiding every moment of our day. So let's not fight against it. Because I don't know if you're like me at all, but when things fall apart and don't go as planned, I tend to get a little frustrated and anxious. Anybody relate to that? But how's that lead, though? That leads to harmful interactions with your loved ones. You take your frustration out on them. Separation from the joy that God brings forth every day for us to enjoy. And this overall dissatisfaction with life. That is one of the greatest deceptions of Satan, is to make us so dissatisfied that we sulk and think that there's nothing good. But if you stop, God will provide for you everything that you need and give you a beautiful peace and joy to go at every day of life. Do you agree with that? You're an awesome group of people. So here's my advice this morning. Stop trying to work so hard against God's plan and just accept it over your life. They may be very impromptu. You may get called into some very awkward situations, but I promise you'll grow out the other side of it. God does not set out each day to make us miserable, to demonstrate His authority over our life, even if we feel like, God, I want to do what I want to do, not what you want to do. Anybody relate to that? Doesn't matter if you feel like a foreigner who does not belong in God's kingdom. All that matters is that you're obedient. You see this acceptance through Ruth. You see that she's brought into the family of God because her heart is open to His direction. That's all He asked. That's all He's ever asked of His people. Ruth is a beautiful testament to God's loving nature for anyone who's willing to open their heart. So a little bit of a recap. In chapter 1, Brian brought forth God's providence. Really, it's an underlying theme of the whole book. Chapter 2 is God's grace, and chapter 3 is our obedience. That's really what this one's kind of turned back on us. Are we going to be obedient to His call? Ruth could have refused Naomi's advice to go to the threshing floor. Boaz could have pushed away and left the redemption up to the other guy. But instead, we're left with this suspense to see if Boaz is going to come riding in on a stallion as the knight in, shining armor. And then you look at verse 18. Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." Boaz has a sense of urgency now, doesn't he? He's going to figure this out. And we should all have a burning desire to follow God every day of our lives. And now, we may never be called to be a kinsman redeemer. You may never have to tote loads of barley around because our cultural practices are simply different. And that's okay. But what this points is a greater picture of redemption that God has given us in the form of Jesus Christ. Okay? Each and every day we have an opportunity to lay our sin to God, to repent of that, to be renewed, to be made whole, and to live for His glory. Really, this story's moving towards that greater plan of redemption. And if you will be obedient and we keep following along and finish this sermon series out, you're going to see the wonderful glory that God will work in your life if you're obedient. You may be called to give a few things away, but I promise you what he replaces it with will be far greater than what you could imagine. But it hurts a little to get there. It's not easy. And you have to let go of self. That's the hardest thing. As someone who deals with that every day, I get it. But Jesus Christ is the greater picture of redemption. And that's what I want you guys to grasp this morning. If you've not accepted Jesus Christ, if you've not given your life to Jesus Christ, we have an opportunity to do that every time that we come together. And I'd like to have that conversation. Let's pray. Father, in your glory through this book of Ruth written thousands of years ago, we still get to see your truth come through in a real and vibrant way that supersedes our understanding. You move in us through your Spirit. You enlighten us. You sharpen each other by the presence of being around other believers. And that's what we have to do. That's what we're called to do, is to invest our life and our time seeking things above, seeking you and not the world. And if we will obediently follow you, the measure of blessing that you pour out over our life is something that we literally cannot fathom. But it takes sacrifice. It takes sacrifice of the pleasures of this life to live for the things in the next. But you give us a glory, you give us this opportunity, and I thank you for this message of Ruth that paints this vibrant picture of love story, and I can't wait to see how it plays out. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.